Whether you are about to make your very first coffee or if you've made hundreds of thousands of coffee in the past, then you are going to have to use multiple processes, approximately 6 depending on the type of coffee that you're going to make. Starting from the beginning, we're going to be operating the grinder. Then we're going to be tamping the grinds into that portafilter. Then we're going to extract those coffee grinds into the cup that we're going to be using, or the glass. Then we're going to steam up the milk required for that. Then we're going to be doing the pouring of that milk that we've steamed, and we're going to bring it all together for the final touches. This is a lot to think about if it's your first coffee that you're going to make, because you're going to have to exhibit a certain degree of skill in each of these different processes that I've just mentioned. So if we have 6 processes involved in making a coffee, in making a latte in particular, then if you wanted to improve your latte, all you would have to do would be to work on any one of these processes. So since this is aimed at new baristas, I'm going to go into each of these steps with a little bit of detail. We're not going to develop the most advanced techniques for each of these processes. We're simply going to give you some handy tips on how to get to the next level. So with the operation of the grinder, we really just want to make sure that we get the right amount of coffee. So coffee, we want to make sure that we grind enough. We don't want to have too little coffee grinds. If we don't quite fill up the basket properly, then when we go to tamp it, it's going to be less coffee in that basket, and that means that that's going to affect the extraction. Whereas if we overfill the portafilter to begin with, and then we level it off, there's going to be approximately the same amount of coffee grinds in each single portafilter that we do up. So that's the matter of consistency. There are many different types of grinders in the market, but if you're using a manual grinder that you manually turn on and off and dispense with the little grinding lever, I'm going to recommend to grind extra for multiple drinks. So why do I recommend this? Well, the grinding part of this process is actually the rate limiting step. So that means that no matter how quickly you spin the grinding chamber out to try and get the coffee grinds into the portafilter, it's going to have an absolute minimum time that you can do that because of the coffee gets ground at a slower rate. So ideally, if we can leave the grinder running, if we're doing extra drinks at the same time, we've got extra time to do other things. And when we have enough coffee, we turn the grinder off, and we've got enough coffee grinds in that chamber to quickly dispense those coffee grinds, rather than standing at the grinder for a minimum of 30 seconds or a minute and just slowly getting the right amount of coffee out. You can leave that running, it's going to fill up that grinding chamber, and you're going to be able to dispense a lot very quickly, providing that the grinder has been running long enough to get all the coffee grinds for you. My third tip to help out for a new barista is to use controlled movements. So what do I mean by controlled movements? You may have seen people operate a manual grinder before, and as I mentioned, the rate limiting component of the grinder is actually the grinding mechanism itself. So it's only going to dispense a certain amount of coffee at a certain amount of time. So if you can let that build up, get enough coffee grinds, and then slowly dispense the coffee in a controlled way into the portafilter. You've probably seen people that go like they really try and use that lever as quickly as possible. That's only going to put extra wear and tear on your wrists, and it's not going to have a significant effect on the speed at which you can do the extraction, because you're waiting for the coffee to be ground anyway. So if you can have nice controlled movements, slowly fill up that portafilter. When you have enough coffee grinds in the grinding chamber, you're going to outlive the other baristas that just rapidly try and dispense the coffee grinds. So these 3 tips are going to get you started for this process. So to summarize, effectively, we want to grind enough coffee beans for the drink that we're making, and we want to dispense enough of those coffee grinds. We don't want to get 3/4 of the way and not have enough coffee grinds and just go ahead and tamp anyway. You need that minimum quantity where you overfill the basket, brush off the excess grinds, and you're going to have the same product again and again. You want to grind extra coffee grinds for multiple drinks. So if you're making multiple drinks at the same time, this is only one process out of 6. So you can be working on other processes while you're waiting for that grinder to fill up the grinding chamber. That way you spend a minimum amount of time at that grinder. You might only spend 15-20 seconds after the grinder has gotten full to dispense all the coffee, tamp it and put it into the machine, rather than standing at that grinder for 2 minutes waiting for it to dispense all of the coffee that you need for all the drinks that you're making. If you're in it for the long run, then you want to have controlled movements. You want to decrease any excessive movements that are going to cause wear and tear on your wrist, on your other joints, and generally things that could cause injury over a short period of time. Avoid that. Try and be as controlled and as precise as you can, and that's going to give you a lot of benefits in the long run. So if we go through these in a logical order, the grinder was the first part of our process. The next step, we're actually going to be talking about the tamping. So we're thinking we've got enough coffee grinds, we've filled it up enough, and we've leveled it off so there's a smooth surface in which we can start to think about tamping. So then we go on to the actual tamp. And I'm going to give you a few hints just to get you started if you are a new barista from that perspective. So, number 1 with tamping. What we want to do is we want to exert a appropriate, consistent amount of pressure during the day. So if we're doing 100 shots, we're going to try and put a consistent amount of pressure on. It's hard for us to measure how many kilos of force that we're using and how much we've compacted the coffee grinds, so it's a bit more of a feeling. One thing that I'm going to suggest is that when I first started, I was using my wrist to put all the pressure on, and because I was doing that, I was putting too much pressure through the wrist and my wrist was getting sore by the end of the day. And if you're working 5 days a week, one after the other, that's going to cause injury over the long run. So what I'm going to suggest is to lean into the bench. What I mean by leaning into the bench is because you're going to have that portafilter with the coffee grinds on the edge of the bench. So you're going to lean and put some body weight onto that tamper to get that all tamped inside. That is going to be a lot more consistent because you're actually dropping your body weight onto the tamper. You're not going to put all of your body weight, you're going to put enough there that it leaves a consistent amount of force and condenses it to a suitable level. So I'm just going to basically write consistent force. So with more practice, you are going to be more consistent. A good measure of showing that you've actually put enough pressure into the portafilter is that you can spin it around or you can hold it upside down and those coffee grinds are not going to fall out. If they're too loosely packed, they will fall out. I can do that without any hassle. I don't worry about it. I'm not worried at all when I put it upside down because I know it's not going to fall out. And that just comes with the confidence of being a barista for a long period of time. So lean into the bench and use consistent amount of force. Keep practicing that. Try and get the same amount of force. It's not going to be exactly the same every time unless you're using an automatic tamper. This leads into the next part. Because you're actually leaning onto the bench and you're putting a bit more pressure onto the portafilter, you want to be aware of uneven tamping. You kind of have to see this one to believe it. When I first heard about it, I thought it was just something that someone had made up. So when you put force onto it, and if it's more on an angle rather than straight, it can actually, your tamp can end up looking more like on an angle like that instead of being flat. So that is something you have to look at. It's very hard to look top down on. You kind of have to bring it up and kind of examine it from the side to be able to see that there is a uneven tamp there. And what is that going to do? So if you've used the same amount of pressure and everything else is good about it, but it's on a slight angle. The portafilter and the spouts, where the spouts go, if your puck is on an angle like this, then there's going to be less coffee between this side and this spout, and there's going to be more coffee from here to this spout here. So you're going to end up with more water coming through this side, and if you were doing 2 shots and 1 cup under each spout, one of those glasses is going to get a lot of espresso liquid, the other one isn't going to get much liquid at all. So you could say that the water is going to go through one side very fast, and in which case the shot that corresponds to that is going to be under extracted, and then the other side, because it's got too much coffee there, it's going to be over extracted with less liquid in there. So that is something to keep an eye on as well. It's not always apparent, and it can exist to a small degree with not being too much of a significant issue, but we want to try and get it as flat as we can. If you do use an automatic tamper, there's no worry about that, but because we're leaning and we're putting our own unbalanced force onto it, there's a higher chance of that happening, especially if you're not aware of it. The final tip that I want to give you in regards to tamping is simply to remove excess grinds. So what I mean about removing excess grinds is that when you utilize the grinder and you start to dispense the coffee grinds are going to go all over that portafilter. So there's going to be a mound in the middle, but also those 2 metal lugs. So these lugs go up into the machine and they help to anchor it in, because it goes up into the machine and then goes along a groove, and that locks it in. So if you get any coffee grinds on top of those metal lugs and you put it straight into the coffee machine, those coffee grinds are going up into the coffee machine, and they're going to cause it to be, it's going to erode over time. And even if it doesn't, then it's going to have an effect on the taste as well. Even just from the cleaning perspective, it's a lot of extra work. So when you've ground your coffee, when you've got it all filled up in the portafilter and then you've tamped it, you're going to have some little coffee grinds that have went onto the lugs, they've went onto the top of the basket. So the easiest way to get rid of that is just to flip the portafilter a full 360 degrees. That will get rid of most of them. And what I also like to do is just run my finger very quickly along the lugs and just use my hand over the top of the basket. And that is just going to get rid of any coffee grinds that are still sitting on top of the basket or the lugs. So let's talk about the third process, and this is going to be the extraction process. Now, if your coffee machine has been properly set up, you're not going to have to worry about the liquid or the volume that gets dispensed. You can happily just leave that as it is. But what we can influence with the extraction process is the time taken to get the volume extracted from the coffee machine. So ideally, depends on how your coffee machine is set up. So because of the menu that we offer, because of the unique kind of characteristics of the sizes, we have 1 group head. So we've basically got 3 groups on the machine, and we've got 3 buttons for each one. This first button is a double ristretto. This second button is the double shot. And this third button is basically an accessory button. It's called the continuous pour button. And if you press this button, it's just going to keep just pouring out water non-stop until you turn the button to turn it off again, until you press the button again, sorry. So having these 3 here, we have the double ristretto on the left, which is 45 mils of extraction liquid. We've got the double shot, which is 60 mils, and we've got this continuous pour that's also used for cleaning as well. So we'll hold that down with the first button to bring up the cleaning cycle menu. So that is what we do. I'm just going to write down 45 mils because that's the volume we're looking for. $60 mils for the double shot. And effectively, when you press one of these buttons, the double ristretto or double shot, it's going to keep going until this volume has been reached, and then it's going to switch off. So this is what I mean about the volume. If the volume's set, you don't have to play around with the volume at all. What we're going to do is be talking about the actual extraction time. Now, an important note as well is that this isn't 45 mils of water, this isn't 60 mils of water, it's 45 and 60 mils of extraction liquid. And that includes, if we have a little shot glass like this is the actual liquid itself, and then we have the crema layer on top. And both the crema layer and the extraction liquid itself equals the volume that we're looking for. So the crema itself is actually counted as part of that liquid layer. It may not be for you, but as long as you're consistent, then stay with that approach. Don't kind of chop and change. So now what we're influencing here is we're influencing the extraction time. So we can do that by changing the grind of the coffee. If we have coarse coffee, it doesn't pack together as well, and that means that the water runs through quicker, which makes us have a fast extraction time, and the coffee can be under extracted as a result. Now, if we go the opposite way and we get really fine coffee, that packs in really well. The water finds it very hard to get through, and that increases the extraction time because it takes longer for the water to get through. It takes longer for that volume to come out. Therefore, this button is on for longer, and we have a longer extracted coffee, which can get to the point where you've extracted too much, causes an over extraction. We've not only extracted what we wanted to extract, we've extracted stuff that we didn't want to touch. We wanted to leave it back in that coffee puck. So effectively, we're looking for a range of times. My perfect amount of time that I've always aimed for in the past has been 21 seconds for a double ristretto and 28 seconds for a double shot. Now I do change up this little range, but because it's kind of hard to get exactly the same amount of time for each one, there's a bit more of a variability there, and that's because there's so many different processes involved. There's the grinding process, there's the tamping process, there's the how long the grinder's been warming up. Like, it might be really hot or it might be cold, it might be the first coffees of the day. Your portafilter might be warm, it might be cold. There's so many different factors that influence this. So this is why I typically aim for a range of 15 seconds to 25 seconds for the double ristretto, and about, I'm going to say here, 21 seconds to 35 seconds for the double shot. So what I mean by this is that if I press this button to do an extraction for the 60 mils and I end up getting 21 seconds instead of 28 seconds, I look at the shot, I think, is it visually acceptable? Does the crema look good? Is there enough volume? If yes, I'm going to use it for the coffee that I'm going to be making, and then I will adjust this to make it finer, and by making it finer, that increases the amount of extraction time, and hopefully we get closer to 28 seconds. And you just basically keep doing this. You have this range that you aim for, try and get it in there. If it doesn't quite go in there, then take a look at the actual end result. Does it look good? Does it have an appropriate amount of crema? Is it visually appealing? Would I use that for someone's coffee? If yes, then use it and adjust the grinder. If not, get rid of that shot, adjust the grinder and remake, and then repeat the process until you've got coffee that you're happy to serve customers. You have to know when to not use stuff like this. So if it does look very pale, if there's hardly any crema at all, that's going to affect the final product for the customer in a bad way. So it's best to avoid using old shots. It's best to avoid using coffee that's really under extracted or over extracted as well for those reasons. Just briefly as well, if this is very new to you and you're not understanding this process of why I have a double ristretto button and a double shot button, how do I do single shots? Well, the answer behind that is that when I press the double shot button, I've got the portafilter. I'm not good at drawing, sorry. Got the two spouts. And I've got two shot glasses. So not as clear to see there, but essentially this is the double shot. I press the 60 ml button and it's going to put 30, providing the tamp is even and consistent, I should get 30 mils of extraction liquid out of each spout. And that is how I get 30 mils or a single shot without having a single shot button. Now we move on to the next part. And I know I've said that there are 6 processes, and that is essentially right. It's correct for milk coffees. So we would be almost finished at this stage if we were making a long black, because we don't need any milk with it. But if we are going to be doing a latte, cappuccino, flat white, etc., we also need to think about the milk steaming process. So the first step for milk steaming is that you need to get the milk. So we need the right amount of milk. But having said that, if you always try and get just the right amount of milk, 50% of the time you're going to have a little bit too much, and 50% of the time you're going to have not quite enough. And it's so annoying getting to the not quite enough bit, because it feels like it's an unfinished product. If you went to give that to the customer, or if I received one, I would look at it and think, that doesn't quite look right. I'd still drink it and it'd still be very tasty, but it doesn't quite fulfill the minimum requirement for me. So I'm going to give you, as a new barista, the first piece of advice is going to be to overfill your jugs. The reason behind this is that we can consider this example. So if you had a coffee that you're making and you tried to get just the right amount but you fell short, you're going to have to, after you finish pouring and realize that you've made that mistake, you're going to have to get a second jug. You're going to have to fill it up with a minimum quantity of milk. You're going to have to steam that up and then pour into the coffee, which has been sitting there for 30 seconds to a minute. So it does end up giving you a product that's not as good as it could have been. And you're also going to end up with extra wastage from the milk, because if you had to get a second jug and you only needed 20 mils out of that jug, you have to steam up like a minimum quantity, 100 mils, 150 mils. You can't just fill a jug with 20 mils and try to steam it up with your steam wand in a controlled fashion. This minimum quantity of milk is essentially the smallest amount that you can safely and in a controlled way, steam it up to have the right texture, the right temperature, and the right amount of froth as well for the drink that you're making. So by intentionally overfilling your jugs, at least to begin with, you're going to always have enough milk. You're not going to have that problem of not quite having enough, which is going to help you out in the long run, because if you don't have to steam up a second jug all the time, you're going to have less wastage. You're going to have less jugs to clean up, and you're going to be able to finish your drink from start to finish. So there's going to be no long period of time where the coffee is just waiting for that final bit of milk before it can get taken away. When we are steaming up milk, we are thinking of 3 things. We're thinking firstly of the froth that we're going to be generating. Then we're also going to be thinking about the texture of the milk. So by texture, I mean how small are those bubbles, how mixed in are those bubbles with the milk. And finally, we're going to be trying to get it to the correct temperature. If it is not hot enough, customers are going to give that milk or give that coffee back to you and say, can you please heat this up a little bit more? So temperature, very important. If you can get the correct texture and the correct temperature, that shows off your skill as a barista. If you get the correct amount of froth for the drink, that shows your knowledge. You know how much froth to put on your drink, and also to a degree your skill level as well for getting that correct amount of froth into your milk. So by focusing on these 3 components, firstly getting the right amount of froth, secondly maintaining the correct texture, and thirdly getting that correct temperature for the product that we're making, we are going to have very, very good milk if we focus on these ones. In terms of what do you focus on first, my advice is to focus on all 3 equally, because it's far better to have an average amount of froth, an average texture, and a temperature that's within the range. It's a bit more on the average side, rather than have perfect froth, but perfect amount of froth, like exactly 1 centimeter for a latte, but you've got all these big bubbles and the texture's just not quite there, and it's 50 degrees instead of 68 degrees. So having perfect and under perfect rather than You just need average for all of these to begin with, and try and focus on one variable at a time while trying to keep the other variables as consistent and high quality as possible. Because this is a video that's aimed towards new baristas, but I'm sure other baristas are going to get a bit more out of this video as well, I'm going to tell you just to focus on lattes, or focus on latte milk. You may have already heard this, but there are a lot of cafes that will make latte milk for everything. So you get a cappuccino that's got less froth than what I would make. You've got a latte that's spot on, and you've got a flat white that is very frothy for a flat white. That is acceptable to begin with, especially if you're learning, because if you are getting the right amount of froth for the latte, then you can really focus on the texture and the temperature. If you had latte froth for a flat white or a cappuccino, I'd still say that that's average. So that's an average score for the three variables that I was talking about in the previous example. So that means that if you focus on latte milk and froth, you can then really focus on getting the correct texture and the correct temperature. So if you're just starting out, try and do latte milk for all the drinks that you're making, and then that's your first stage. Make sure you get out of that stage. Make sure you then try and get the correct amount of froth for the drinks that you're making. In fact, one step further, I would say to do cappuccinos and lattes with latte milk, and I would say to steam up your flat white with latte milk. And the first thing you do when you've got that jug freshly steamed is that you dump the first part of that pour out. And that is going to carry a lot of the froth with it. Even though it's a tiny bit of the first bit of the pour, it's going to have 100% froth in that you're getting rid of. And when you start to pour, it's going to have about half the amount of froth on the flat white as it does with the latte. So your flat whites are going to be very good if you start off with latte milk and you dumped that first bit. Your lattes are going to be perfect, and your cappuccinos are going to be on the flatter side, but they're not too flat. So I consider the example instead, if you made cappuccino milk for everything. Your cappuccinos would be perfect, your lattes would be very frothy, and your flat whites would be unacceptable. Consider also the other example, if we did flat white milk for all three, then our cappuccinos will be flat cappuccinos, and people are going to absolutely hate that. One of the big reasons why people get cappuccinos is because of that amount of froth. Even if you cover it with a lot of chocolate, if there's no froth, customers are going to bring it back and say, I need some froth on this cappuccino. Your latte may be slightly acceptable depending on how frothy your flat white is, but still it's not ideal to have a flat latte, and your flat whites will be perfect if you're aiming for flat white milk. So this is just a stepping stone. Make sure that you get over to the next stepping stone after you've been focusing on latte milk for a while. It's just designed to help you to really focus on the texture and the temperature while just keeping the froth static, not worrying about how much froth you're putting in. You're trying to get the correct texture, trying to keep it constantly mixed in, and getting the right amount of temperature for the customer. If you are starting out, chances are you're going to sometimes forget exactly how much froth that a cappuccino latte or flat white has. I'm not going to define it in this video, but try and remember, cappuccinos are the frothiest, followed by lattes, followed by flat whites. If you still find it difficult to remember, simply think of as lattes being in the middle, flat whites being flat because of their name, and cappuccinos being the opposite. They're dome shaped, so they've got a bit of a cap on them. So that is another way that you can remember the cappuccinos have the most froth. I think it's also worth mentioning at this point in time is that from my extensive experience as being a takeaway barista, out of these three variables that we have already talked about, I've found that in my own experience, customers favor temperature the most. So if you had two coffees and one of them had a really good temperature, the other one had a bad temperature, the customers would be more upset about the coffee not having the correct temperature than they would be about the texture. So as long as it's the right temperature, they don't mind too much if the milk is a bit less textured as normal, and followed by the froth. If they got a cappuccino and there was hardly any froth, they would be less upset about it compared to the temperature. As long as it was good temperature, they wouldn't worry too much about the amount of froth. And one of the reasons because that happens is because when you do put a lid on a drink with froth on it, the froth tends to stick to the lid. When you take the lid off, the froth is all stuck to the lid. Conversely, if you just sip through that little hole for the takeaway drinks, you're going to get the liquid coming through, but the froth is going to be separated and it's going to stick and stay on that lid, and it's not going to come out when you drink the drink. So that essentially handles the milk steaming process. So that's going to lead us quite nicely to the pouring process. So we have the extractions at this point in the glasses that we're using. We have the milk that's been already steamed up with a focus on texture, temperature, and the amount of froth. So then we're going to get to the pouring process. I'm just going to write pouring here. There are two main points that I wanted to discuss with the pouring. And number one is angle pour, or angled. So by this, I essentially mean, I'm going to try to show you in this picture, but that might be too extreme actually. So that's essentially the latte with the crema, and this is going to be your milk jug. Handle there as well. So essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to, if this is the milk here, if this is the extraction liquid here, if we've got these on an angle, the distance between the spout of this milk jug here and this crema is very small compared to if you had a flat glass and you had your jug here. So by angling this glass here, we're going to get a lot closer. The milk is going to have a lot smaller distance to fall compared to this example here. This has got a big distance to fall. And the reason why that is particularly relevant is that if you have a smaller distance for the milk to fall, it's going to cause less disruptions as it hits the surface of the espresso. So it's not going to splash, it's not going to generate large bubbles. If we have a good texture from the steaming process in the jug, that texture is going to get smoothly transferred across if the distance is only very small, and the froth can essentially glide onto the top of the drink rather than hitting and going straight underneath into the liquid below. This is going to help out a lot for the latte art process, which I'm not going to get into too much detail in this video as it's only designed to help new baristas that are really getting into this. But by doing this, we're going to give ourselves the best chance of setting up the coffee in the best way possible to keep the texture and to also get ready for latte art and to give us our best chance at doing that. So that's the first step. For the second step, I'm going to be talking about something called the circular pour. Yep, so that's kind of hard to see. There we are, so the circular pour. This is going to be a little bit hard to actually write and to draw, so I'm going to demonstrate it quickly, but if say you had the cup right here and you had your jug, what you'd be wanting to do is pour in a circle around the surface of the crema. And what that does by pouring in a circle is that it saturates the crema layer equally. So if you just focused on one side of the crema, it's going to get a lot thinner there, it's going to start developing latte art, but you're going to have pockets of crema that have no saturation. They don't respond well to the latte art that's happening. So you want to make sure that that crema gets evenly saturated, and that's the point with doing the circular pour at the start. Even if you don't even think about doing any latte art at this stage, if you just wanted to do that circular pour, just to get it part of your routine, you want to do this circular pour once or twice, and while doing that, you're trying to fill up to the halfway point and then stop. That's all you need to do to get the base required for any sort of latte art that you want to do. It's essential that you saturate the froth, that you saturate the crema evenly with the froth before you start to do the latte art pattern on it. So these tips here for pouring, the angle pour and the circular pour, are going to get you the final product in the best possible position for then doing any latte art. And even if you weren't to do it, if you just had really good textured milk, good temperature, good amount of froth, and you had a good extraction, and you were pouring using this angle pour and the circular pour, it's almost certain that latte art is going to happen no matter what you do anyway. Like, it's just going to start to materialize on the top of or the surface of the drink that you're making. So we're getting you to the stage where you're going to start being able to do latte art very quickly as a new barista. Now we get to the final part of this process, which is very simply known as the finishing touches. The finishing touches are essentially anything that wasn't involved with the previous processes that we were talking about. It handles from when the drink was fully poured to when the customer receives it. So it's kind of like a miscellaneous topic, just to cover up all the other little bits and pieces there. So number one, the final touch, we want to make sure that we fill to the top. As I mentioned earlier in the video, it doesn't look very good if you have a drink that you've made, such as a latte, and you've filled it kind of most of the way, but there's like a little bit of space at the top where it didn't quite get filled up. That's going to look unprofessional. It's not going to look like someone's drank out of it, but it's just not going to have, it's going to kind of have that feeling that customers aren't getting what they paid for. So always try and fill your drink right to the top. Now it's a different story if you've made a drink, you filled it up to the top, and the froth has basically collapsed in on itself after a period of 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. That's natural, that's what's going to happen. But if you never fill to the top in the first place, that's what I'm meaning. So you really need to fill them all the way up to the top. This also counts for other people's cups that they bring in. So if they got like a takeaway keep cup or something like that, you want to fill it up as much as you can. You don't want to leave too much space. But also be in mind that you need to leave enough space for the lid to go on. A lot of the lids don't sit on top, they go inside the drink. So if you fill it all the way up to the top, customers are going to spill the drink and it's going to go all over the sides, which is a bit annoying. So filling to the top is one of the first parts of this. The next thing to consider is simply, for dine-in drinks, we want to set them up. So by setting up, I mean we want a saucer and spoon. So if you were the barista, you were making in-house coffees, you finished it off and you put it at the dine-in preparation area, ready to be delivered by your floor staff. If your floor staff were busy and they didn't have a chance to deliver it straight away and they weren't waiting for it with the plate and spoon ready to go, then I would suggest getting a plate and a spoon and putting the drink on, because that signals that the drink is done, the drink is finished. If you just leave a drink by itself on the bench, sometimes people can think that it's a drink that you've made for yourself or you've made for the floor staff and they won't deliver it. And it just doesn't look ready to go either. If it is ready to go, if it's got its plate, it's got its spoon, the drink is in there as well, that signals to everyone that that coffee is ready. It should be taken straight away to the customers that are dining, because from here onwards, the quality is only decreasing naturally over time. So by doing that, it also signals to your floor staff that it needs to be delivered straight away. And if you make a milk coffee and it hasn't been delivered by the time you've got the next one over, that's a good sign that you need to deliver it. Your floor staff is probably a little bit too busy to deliver it. If you are doing a lot of takeaway coffees, as a takeaway barista or just as a regular barista, but you've got a lot of takeaway clientele, one of the first steps that I'm going to teach you as a new barista is simply to put a lid on when finished. So I'm just going to write put lid on. by putting a lid on, it's essentially like step 2 here. It's like getting the saucer and the spoon. By putting a lid on, it signals that that drink is done. There's nothing else that you're going to add to that drink. You're not going to stir it. You don't need to put sugars in it. You don't need to put chocolate on top. There's nothing else ready to be done with that drink. So it's ready to be called out. Or if the customer's not there yet, you can put it on the machine and it's ready to be done. Now, the reason why I say as well to put the lid on it is because over time, the froth is going to collapse back into the drink, and you might be tempted to top it back up again. But if you had 5 jugs of used milk in front of you and you were going to top this one up again and you were using alternate milks, you might have accidentally grabbed a soy jug and filled this up with soy milk. Or this might be soy milk and you've just gotten regular milk and topped it up. So by putting a lid on it, it prevents you from subconsciously topping it up with a jug, and by the time you finish you're like, oh, was that actually the right jug? So that's going to help out with that too. So that is essentially all of the tips that I wanted to give you from those 6 processes. So from the grinding aspect right at the start to the tamping process, the extraction process, then we start to talk about the milk steaming, the milk pouring, and the final touches. So you're going to be doing all of these processes if you're making any sort of milk drink. As a new barista, you're going to be working through all of this sort of stuff. So there's a lot involved in making one coffee, and I've broken it all down here for you so you can kind of just work on one thing at a time and hopefully develop some very good proficiency in a short amount of time. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.